And we've got a jam-packed program for you, laden with incredible information, much of which I'm sure will leave you absolutely gobsmacked, as my British ancestors used to say. So stow your carry-on in the overhead compartment, fasten your seatbelts, put your tray in the upright position, and enjoy the flight. In the second hour tonight, an incredible, some might say unbelievable story that has all the intrigue of an Ian Fleming novel, complete with secret agents, double agents, a plot to bring a Cold War enemy's economy to its knees, secret bank accounts holding unimaginable wealth, missing gold, murder, assassination attempts, and much more. It's the remarkable story of one Emil Wanta, a.k.a. the $27.5 trillion man. You heard me correctly. Trillion with a T. Wanta, a Polish Catholic kid from Wisconsin, quickly rose through the ranks to become President Ronald Reagan's favorite secret agent. And together with Dutch Reagan, Lee Wanta and some others, including Bill Colby, former CIA director, and William Casey, Colby's successor at the CIA, hatched a complex but ingenious plan in the early 80s to end the Cold War by essentially destabilizing the Russian ruble, thereby wrecking the Soviet economy. The plan started with $150 billion in seed money from the Department of Defense budget, which was turned over to Wanta. Reagan then enacted an executive order which allowed intelligence agents like Wanta to set up what are called Title 18 Section 6 companies, which were allowed to operate inside and outside the United States for intelligence purposes. These corporations were funded by the U.S. Treasury, but had no budget oversight, and the intelligence agents who ran them, like Lee Wanta, were essentially free agents. They were hired guns for hire, junkyard dogs, as they're called. They weren't employed by any of the alphabet intel agencies like the CIA, FBI, or NSA, so if they were caught doing anything illegal, they were on their own. And the intel agencies who ran these, or who hired them, and the White House in some cases, had plausible deniability. The upside for the intel agencies or the intel agents who ran these Title 18 fronts was that many of them made above and beyond the initial startup capital provided unknowingly by the taxpayers, and that money was theirs to keep. And as we'll discover, it was through a series of these Title 18 front companies that Lee Wanta made reportedly, and I know this sounds crazy, but I have to tell you it's very well documented, Lee Wanta made on the order of $27.5 trillion. Now, he paid back the original $150 billion investment to the U.S. Treasury after the first 6 months. The $27.5 trillion was raised in a very complex set of financial deals, including currency swaps and prime bank guarantees. And here's where this story affects you, me, everyone out there. It was President Reagan's intention that the money, the $27.5 trillion, much of it was to be put back into the U.S. Treasury, where it could be used to serve the American people. Think about that. Today, the U.S. federal debt sits somewhere north of $17 trillion. That $27.5 trillion could put the United States back in the black and have plenty left over to build schools, repair roads and bridges, build hospitals, provide housing for America's veterans. Hell, enough to build a high-speed rail across America, providing 2 million full-time jobs with benefits. How does that sound? There's only one problem. While Leo Wanta would like nothing more than to return those trillions to the American people, he can't. At least not yet. Much or most of the money has disappeared from Wanta's secret bank accounts, and the people who took it have no intention of giving it back. Over the years, they've tried to pressure Wanta into giving up the golden goose by sending him to jail on trumped-up charges. They even kidnapped him and sent him to prison in Wisconsin and later Oklahoma. For a while, he was under house arrest. The only reason he's not dead, like his close friend and partner, is there's still some of that money out there, and they need Wanta to tell them where it is. Lee Wanta, or Ambassador Lee Wanta, and we'll find out how he became an ambassador later on, does not understandably do many interviews. He won't even divulge where he lives. But tonight, possibly one of the first times ever on a blowtorch network, he's going to join us, perhaps, we hope. I was even warned that he could show up here, unannounced, at our Toronto affiliate, where I'm now perched. He could show up at the studio in L.A. In the meantime, we'll be joined by his official biographer, Marilyn Gruwald Wanta, in hour 2. And she'll set the stage and tell us about the life and times of Ambassador Lee Emil Wanta, President Reagan's favorite secret agent. Then, as I say, if the stars align, the man himself, the intrepid Lee Wanta, may join us. Let me quote from Marilyn Barnwall's official and exclusive biography of Ambassador Leo Emil Wanta. If you are alive, you need to understand what happened to Ambassador Leo Emil Wanta. His life has had a major impact on yours, even if you've never heard his name. It will continue to impact the lives of your children and grandchildren. Why? He's the guy who brought down the economy of the Soviet Union, and while doing it, lawfully purchased 2,000 metric tons of gold from the Soviet Union's central bank. He's been called the $27.5 trillion man, and it's an apt title. He got that name through savvy investing that resulted in the fall of the Iron Curtain, and by putting together money from over 200 banks around the world to pay off the debt that is currently driving the United States into unnecessary bankruptcy. Unnecessary? Yes. If that portion of the American government that has gone rogue hadn't stolen the funds President Ronald Reagan had the foresight to have Leo Wanta put aside for the American people, there would be no debt for you, your children, your grandchildren, and their children for generations to come. His life has indeed impacted yours though you may never have heard the name Leo Wanta spoken. Well, you're about to hear a lot about Leo Wanta when Marilyn Barnwall joins us right after this. This is Coast to Coast AM. Please stay a while. Marilyn Magruder Barnwall began her career in 1956 as a journalist with the Wyoming Eagle in Cheyenne. During her 20 years plus as a banker and bank consultant, she wrote extensively for the American Banker, Bank Marketing Magazine, Trust Marketing Magazine, and was U.S. consulting editor for Private Banker International, plus other major banking industry publications. She's written 7 nonfiction books about banking and taught private banking at Colorado University for the American Bankers Association. She's authored 7 banking books, 1 dog book, 1 work of fiction about banking, of course, and she's served on numerous boards in her community. Barnwall is the former editor of the National Peace Officer magazine and as a journalist has written guest editorials for the Denver Post, Rocky Mountain News, and Newsweek, among others. On the Internet, she's written for News with Views, WorldNet Daily, Canada Free Press, Christian Business Daily, Business Reform, and others. She's been quoted in Time, Forbes, Wall Street Journal, and other national and international publications. She could be found in the Who's Who America, Who's Who of American Women, Who's Who in Finance and Business, and Who's Who in the World. And she is the official and exclusive biographer of Ambassador Leo Emil Wanta. And she is the author of that biography, and it's entitled Wanta, Black Swan, White Hat. Marilyn Barnwall, welcome to Coast. How are you?
I'm fine. How are you? Gosh, I was listening to you read that portion out of that chapter, and you have got I've got to hire you to do the audio. It was wonderful. Thank you for that.
Well, you know, it's an amazing story, but many people listening, when you use the term trillion, the $27.5 trillion man, many people, I'm guessing, their eyes are rolling back and they're saying, $27 trillion, come on. How could anyone possibly amass that kind of wealth in 100 lifetimes, let alone one? And we will get into that. But let's start off, Marilyn, if we could. I've sort of begun the discussion on who Leo Wanta is. But just give us sort of a thumbnail sketch, an overview of where he came from, and then how you met him.
Oh, wow. Lee became involved with intelligence work very young, actually. He was 15 years old. And Senator Wiley, who was the Wisconsin senator, I believe he headed the very powerful Foreign Relations Committee, heard Lee giving a speech one day. And Lee had a very bad stuttering problem when he was young. And Senator Wiley became interested in him. He was very interested in the topic of his speech, sent him to school and to Dale Carnegie after studying with Dale Carnegie, the stuttering problem was pretty much eliminated. It happens every now and then, but not very often. And he worked for the John Birch Society in Milwaukee. And interestingly, he did a lot of things for them, but one of the things he did was empty their trash. And the trash would go into a green plastic bag, and he would meet an FBI agent on a bus and give it to a streetcar, I guess, a bus, and give it to him and get off and go home. So he started very young. But really when he got involved was when President Reagan was still President-elect Reagan. He had not yet been, inaugural, hadn't been through it all. And he got a call from William French Smith, who was to be Reagan's new Attorney General. Reagan was looking for a number of people he could trust to help him stabilize Eastern Europe. And finding people you can trust is not the easiest thing to do in Washington, D.C.
You don't say.
So Lee was called to a meeting in Los Angeles at the office of the future Attorney General, William French Smith, and a small task force was formed. It was made up of William Colby, who had been a former director of Central Intelligence, and William Casey, who would become Reagan's director of Central Intelligence. And after the inauguration, the secret task force expanded to include military and other intelligence sources, and they had a number of meetings. And they came to an agreement that if they had $150 billion, they believed they could destabilize the Soviet economy. Lee, I call him Lee. Both names are correct. His birth certificate name is Lee Emil Wanta. His baptism certificate name is Leo Emil Wanta. And in the shadowy world of intelligence operators, it's Leo Wanta, but I tend to refer to him as Lee. But Leo was made trustor of President Reagan's presidential task force, and in that capacity, he was officially responsible for the $150 billion grant President Reagan approved. He was also responsible for returning it to the Treasury, which he did within 6 months. And I'd like to get back to why that's an important point later, but that was where it started, and that was where the $150 billion came, by the way, from, I believe, the Defense Department budget, and so on. Does that answer your question? Or
yeah, that's a good.
More, what kind of personal guy is Lee Wanta?
Well, we can get into that as the hours unfold, and that's a great starting off point, a nice overview. And we will also get into how he parlayed $150 billion into $27.5 trillion, and what happened to it, and so forth. Now, how did the story of how you hooked up with Leo Emil Wanta is equally fascinating.
Well, I'll tell you what, I was living a totally normal life. I was writing books. I had decided in about 2005 that I had seen what was going to happen in 1991, and I started trying to write a fiction book then called Shadow Government, as a matter of fact. I was consulting for a major bank in Cincinnati, Ohio, and that was when they first came out with lines of credit. You put your deed of trust up for, the line of credit and so on. And
they blurred the lines between the commercial and investment banks.
And I couldn't do it. I could not write fiction. I'm used to writing nonfiction and bank textbooks and that kind of thing. But in 2005, I said, the American people are totally unaware of what's happening. So I started writing a fiction book, that would inform them about banking and things like, what is the Bank of International Settlements? What is the International Monetary Fund? What is the Federal Reserve System? And so I had a woman who was a bank consultant, thinly disguised. And I had, wrote this book. And in the middle of it, suddenly out of thin air, really, I was just compelled to bring a new character that I hadn't planned on, a guy named William Leonard, into the plot. And William Leonard, I had never heard of Lee Wanta, never in my life. And suddenly here's this character who's destabilizing the Russian ruble or the economy by taking down the Russian or the Soviet ruble, and so on. And at the end of all of this, 3 months after the book was published in July of 2008, somebody sent me an article about Leo Wanta, and I almost had a heart attack. I said, oh my God, this guy could sue me for fictionalizing his real life. Only my guy only got $13 trillion. William Leonard only, came out of it with $13 trillion, and I thought that was a huge, unbelievable amount,
Yes.
And anyway, 3 months after that, I got an email from a friend who also writes for News with Views, and I was scrolling down just like, you do with all your emails to make sure you've gotten everything, and there, sitting on a page all by itself, was the email address for Ambassador Emil Wanta. And I called CJ right away, and I said, where did you get this? She had never heard of him, had no idea how it was there. And I argued with myself for about 2 hours, and I said, write him a note and tell him. And so I did. And he very kindly responded, and we became friends and started talking on the telephone, after exchanging some emails.
And your initial fear was that he might actually sue you, because your fictional character was almost a duplicate of his real life. It
was absolutely. Lee and I have talked about this many times.
I mean, there's serendipity, and then there's this is just scary.
Yeah, it was scary. It was scary to me. And I'll tell you what, at about June, it was before that, maybe April or May, I sent him, I was already into 20 chapters of the follow-up book to When the Swan's Neck Breaks. I had written Flight of the Black Swan, and I had 20 chapters done, and after I talked to Lee a few times, I said, I'm going to send you this manuscript because William Leonard becomes the primary character in this book, and I don't want you suffering any blowback because of this. And I sent it to him, and when he called me back after he had read the manuscript, he said, how do you know so much about my personal life? And I said, what? I don't know anything about your personal life. And he said, you know my favorite hotel where I used to take my children for brunch on Sundays, the Whitehall in Chicago. Well, I had used that hotel because that's where I used to stay when I consulted for the First National Bank of Chicago. And he said, you know my favorite lunch, which was bacon, lettuce, and tomato sandwich and chicken noodle soup. I mean, it was just a variety of things like that. And he asked me about 5 or 6 questions. And, the hair on the back of his neck had to go up, too. He must have wondered, who is this woman and why is, who's trying to get information about me or out of me or whatever.
So anyway, was he suspicious then initially of you? Was he suspicious?
I was. Yeah, I mean, the first time Lee called and he said, please call him back on a secure phone, I didn't. I thought, I'm not sure I want to get into that. And he called me and called me back the next day, and we started talking. And he is such a gentleman. He has got a wonderful sense of humor. He makes me laugh more than anybody else in the world. And just is a nice guy and knows so much about banking. This guy's a genius. He truly is.
He would have to have a lot on the ball if he's able to parlay $150 billion into $27.5 trillion. We're speaking with Ambassador Emil Wanta's official and exclusive biographer, Marilyn Barnwall, the author of Wanta, A Black Swan, White Hat. Now, it seems, based on what you're saying, that for those that, that believe in fate or what have you, the two of you were destined to come together. And yet, after all this time, you have never met Emil Wanta face to face. Is that correct?
That's right. And we're going on 6 years, Richard, that we talk on the phone every day, sometimes several times a day. But no, we've never met, and yet I know him as well as I know my own son or my own daughter, my own, my family. He's part of my family.
Sure, but it begs the question, Marilyn, and I'm sure you've had this before and asked yourself this question. You've never met this man face to face. The story is unbelievable. The secret agent, Reagan's, favorite junkyard dog, and we'll get into what that means a little bit later, who raises $27.5 trillion almost single-handedly to bring the Soviet Union to its knees and end the Cold War. And yet, you've never met him face to face. How do you know he is, who he says he is?
Well, boy, what a good question. As his official biographer, I have verified the things you'll read or listen to about him that I've had anything to do with. The problem is when it's impossible to verify everything about a secret intelligence operative because what he's doing is secret, obviously. But let me tell you this. This is what I did do, Richard. When I talk about court cases that involve Lee Wanta, I have every court transcript regarding every court action involving him. I know with certainty when I speak about his court cases that the information is absolutely accurate because of my source. When I write about intelligence operations, I have documents that support what I'm saying. Do I have all of them? No. Again, they were highly secret operations. But I do have copies of Wanta's field reports, his letters to Dan Quayle and Dick Cheney and President George H.W. Bush, Bill Clinton, George W. Bush, Barack Obama. I have documents from the Ronald Reagan Library. I have copies of answers that Leo gave under penalty of perjury to those questioning him from various intelligence agencies. Well, he sat on the floor of his prison cells handwriting responses. Lee has a very distinctive script, and I don't believe anybody could copy it to write the hundreds of pages that I'm talking about here. Generally speaking, by the way, when I received those documents, he verified on the telephone that he was the one who sent them. But the most logical question anyone might ask is, how do you know the person you talk with on the telephone and those handwritten records belong to the real Leo Wanta?
Exactly.
Well, I have copies of his mortgage papers Lee Wanta signed when he and his wife purchased their home in Appleton, Wisconsin in 1977, and before he got involved with President Reagan's as his personal intelligence coordinator and in the task force and all that. I have copies of other documents he signed before his status as a secret agent involved, other things. And I had his handwriting analyzed by two experts trained by the FBI. I have pictures of him. How do I know they're him? Last year I sent him a baseball cap with the words Wanta University embroidered on it, and he had a picture taken of himself wearing the cap in front of the Federal Reserve building in St. Louis to send me. I sent a copy to his case manager when he was in prison in Oklahoma, and she verified that it is him. Well, how do I know she's who she says she is? I made 2 trips to Oklahoma to meet and spend days talking with her. I met her friends. I met her family. She's who she says she is. And I met a second case manager while I was there who also made verification. So,
yeah, you've got it documented chapter and verse, and for those still wanting more, one of the reasons the book is not published as a hard copy book is because of the amount of documentation that are actually provided in the book as links. So it's available online, and we'll tell you how to get a hold of and read Wanta, Black Swan, White Hat. Marilyn Barnwall, the official and exclusive biographer of Ambassador Leo Emil Wanta, Reagan's top spy. Back with more in a moment on Coast to Coast. Welcome back to Coast AM. Richard Syrett with you. Hope you'll stay a while. Marilyn Barnwall is the official exclusive biographer of President Ronald Reagan's top secret agent. And Marilyn, we go back to November 1989. Of course, the image of the Berlin Wall tumbling down. That's a memory etched in our psyche forever, for those of us old enough to remember. Little did we know, of course, at the time, what brought that wall down, who was responsible, what forces were at play, and only recently are we learning. Many of us discovered some revelations about Leo Wanta online, and now we're getting the story from you. Exactly, again, let's go back to President Reagan's executive order and the creation of this assembly of individuals, including Leo Wanta, responsible for destabilizing the Soviet economy, which led to the collapse of the Berlin Wall. Let's go back again to the early 80s and explain in very general terms, very simple to understand terms, the mechanism by which Emil Wanta essentially destabilized the Russian ruble and brought the Soviet economy to its knees, ending the Cold War.
Well, there were two things that really had to be done first. Before it was called getting the Soviet economy to a tipping point that would help the plan that Leo Wanta had put together succeed. And the first was in a March 23rd speech about SDR, or Star Wars. President Reagan pointed to a bunch of things and so on. He said that that the United States, the world really, but especially us, had nearly abandoned efforts to develop and deploy defenses against nuclear weapons and so on. And so he was pushing Star Wars. But it was important for more reasons than Reagan stated publicly. It was a costly technology, and a race evolved, and Reagan was heavily criticized over the cost, still is today. But to see whether America or the Soviet Union would go bankrupt first, developing SDI. So, when you compare the cost of what Reagan wanted to do in 1983 to our almost $18 trillion debt today, it was a pittance by comparison, but it gave Washington something to complain loudly about and then do what they always do, pass it on to a committee. But for the Reagan Special Task Force plan to work, the closer to the tilt point of the Soviet economy was, the better the chances of success of Part 2, which involved, it was called, by the way, Operation Still Point, Richard. And Reagan also then had to sign Executive Order 12333, which your listeners can look up on their computers. But on December 4th, 1981, he signed that bill. And it enabled U.S. intelligence operatives who had been briefed to operate on behalf of the United States and establish corporations that were wholly owned by intelligence operatives. Title 18, Section 6 is part of that. That's also something your listeners can check out. It made it possible for intelligence operatives to enter into contracts with intelligence and other elements of the U.S. government. And Leo Wanta conducted extensive intelligence operations in accordance with 3 separate executive orders implemented by Ronald Reagan. And he, by the way, was Ronald Reagan's personal intelligence coordinator. So that's where it started. And then after those 2 things happened, Lee went to Vienna and established a company called New Republic USA Financial Group Limited. And he began,
if I could just interject, just so I'm clear on this,
sure.
Marilyn, the idea is that people like Leo, and he was referred to as a junkyard dog because he wasn't in the employ of any of these alphabet intel agencies like the CIA, the FBI, or the NSA.
Absolutely,
he was kind of
right.
a hired gun,
Yep.
a free agent, which gave the government, or the White House, or President Reagan in this case, plausible deniability, because if Leo Emil Wanta got caught doing whatever he was doing, because he wasn't working officially for the CIA or what have you, he would just be essentially cut off and ignored, and again, plausible deniability. So that put these intel agents that were running these Title 18 companies, these fronts, at great risk.
That's right. That's right. And I mean, it's hard to really understand the seriousness of that, because when you say plausible deniability means if he got arrested doing something, he was there on his own. No government was going to come in and save his butt, frankly.
But the upside here is that any profits, once the initial $150 billion investment was returned to the Treasury, all the proceeds after that really belong to Leo Emil Wanta.
That's exactly right, and it's a really critical point. Thank you for bringing that up, Richard, because, I mean, I use the example of a car loan. You know, when you borrow money from a bank to buy a car, after you've paid the loan off, who owns the car, you or the bank? Well, the same thing and the same principle is true here. There was $150 billion taken over which Lee was the trustor of the account and the funds, and he used those funds to bring down the Iron Curtain, and which, by the way, the Cold War cost America $6 trillion. So it was a tremendous boom for us to be able to do that. And but you know, so there you are. What do you do with that? I don't know.
So how does that transaction happen? The president hands over the desk in the Oval Office a check from the U.S. Treasury for $150 billion signed over to Leo Emil Wanta, and he takes that check.
No, it's not really a check. Unless I'm mistaken, the funds were put in a trust account in the Treasury Department,
okay.
And they were watched pretty closely. So, but he did spend the $150, and guess what? He paid it back within 6 months. So of the time it was given to him, that's how fast he was able to do this. By the way, this is also verified in a book called Thieves' World by Claire Sterling, and it was published by Simon & Schuster in 1994. And she leaves no doubt that Leo Wanta was the primary guy in getting the rubles and bringing down the currency of the Soviet Union.
And unfortunately, the authoress may have paid with her life for publishing that material.
That's right. I mean, she went in for a meeting with the FBI and suddenly had a heart attack, I believe, or a stroke. I'm not sure which. 2 weeks later, and she had no health history of those things. So who knows? You know.
Well, now what I'd like to accomplish, if we can, before the top of the hour, is for you to explain again in very general, and I think the term you use, which I love, is ham and eggs English, to describe the mechanism. How does one turn $150 billion with a B into $27.5 trillion with a T, $27.5 trillion, while at the same time destroying the Soviet economy, ending the Cold War?
Well, these things happened over a broader period of time than it's going to sound like they did. But Lee went to Vienna, established his company, and began meeting with people that represented nations that did business with the Soviet bloc. And that included nations like Iran and Iraq and so on, where oil and gas is involved. It included nations that were part of the Soviet bloc who traded with Moscow, and they were paid in rubles, and it was very important. Rubles couldn't be traded outside of the USSR. They had to be used within the Soviet bloc, and that was the weakness that Leo identified, and he set up an arrangement with Brinks in Holland, and began to obtain rubles. He exchanged them for numerous currencies, the Italian lira, the Japanese yen, the American dollar, Swiss francs, French francs, British pound sterling, you name it. And using the $150 billion that had been made available to him by President Reagan, he could give anyone in the Soviet Union who wanted to exchange rubles for another currency pretty much what they preferred. And you might ask, well, why would anybody in the Soviet Union want to, exchange the rubles? They were very much in the same position that we are right now, that if you had an opportunity to get some of or a lot of your dollars into, for example, a gold-backed currency, you probably, if you live in the United States and have watched the decreasing value of the dollar and the debt that's increasing and the failed economic system that we know we're going to be hit with at the end level at some point in time, you probably would take advantage of that same offer today. So the interesting thing was that New Republic, Lee's company, was able to get just boatloads of rubles in the USSR, and on average it cost them from 18 to 28 cents on the dollar at that time. And at that time, the Soviets valued the ruble. The Soviets valued the ruble. This is the value they placed on it, excuse me, at $1.20. So,
which is total fantasy land, of course, at that time, because, yes.
Absolutely. But USSR pension funds, for example, they were in the same kind of danger our pension funds are in today. Everybody was worried the government was going to take them to pay national debt because they were in so much debt and they were bankrupt. All of them were glad to trade rubles for dollars with New Republic, and Lee got them from embassies. He got foreign funds, KGB funds, Soviet pension funds, postal funds, military GRU funds even, Soviet central bank funds. So, and as he got them, Brinks of Holland wrapped and verified the currencies. There were some counterfeit bills found, and Lee had them eliminated from the mix. He had them thrown away. But then they would go to a development bank. These went, in this case, to the Development Bank of Singapore, for example. And the Soviets, again, valuing their currency at $1.20 per ruble. Well, Lee's $70 billion, for which he had paid the $70 billion in rubles that he was depositing in the Development Bank of Singapore, as an example, he paid only $14 billion for that, but it was worth $84 billion in U.S. dollars. So that gives you some idea of the range of profit that was involved. They were paying on average 23 to 28 cents per ruble, New Republic was.
All right, so how does that destabilize the Russian ruble?
Well, first of all, because suddenly everybody has access to your currency at 20 cents on the dollar, or the ruble in that event, instead of $1.20. Then when they went to the nations, when Lee and his partner, Howie Kwon, when they went to the nations that were indebted to the Soviet Union and said, here, would you like to be able to have access to rubles for, say, 32 cents each? Well, again, they'd only paid 23 cents or 28 cents for them, so they were making a profit there also. But the nations that were indebted to the Soviet Union had a boon. I mean, and they were able to repay their debt to the Soviet Union at 32 cents or 35 cents or whatever was set for a various nation. And the Soviets had no idea this was going on. They were saying, oh, this is wonderful. Look at all the rubles we're getting. The problem is never how many of the dollars or the rubles or any other currency you have. The problem is always in the value. So here you are flooded with currency. You're losing your asset, which is your debt that these nations are paying you, and they're able to pay you back with rubles for which they only paid, say, 32 cents.
Ah, right. Got it. Okay. So thus began the the destabilization of the Russian ruble, which coupled with the Soviets trying to keep pace with the U.S. The arms race
in Star Wars. That's right.
Brought the Soviet economy to its knees.
That's right.
But it didn't end there. Did Leo then not purchase something like 2,000 metric tons of gold from the Russian central bank?
Right. I mean, when the currency fell, Moscow really needed cash, and through New Republic, Lee agreed to purchase 2,000 metric tons of gold from the USSR central bank at $1.08 per ruble. But with rubles, again, the rubles had only cost him 18 to 28 cents each in that event. So, he was able to get 2,000 metric tons of gold at a hugely, 18 to 28 cents per ruble.
Right. The Soviets thought they were pulling one over on him because they took it, down to $1.08. Meanwhile, as you say, he paid 18 to 28 cents per ruble. So what did Leo do with that 2,000 metric tons of gold?
He stored it he took it back to Singapore where he had it resmelted in 12.5 kilogram bars, and then stored it in a vault in Cloton, Switzerland.
And is it still there?
It certainly is.
Oh, my. And given that gold is now hovering around $1,300 an ounce, what is that 2,000 metric tons worth today? Do we know?
About 85 to 87 billion, I would think.
All right, and that's only one small part of this massive
No, that actually the value of the gold isn't included in the 27.5 trillion. No, that's separate. Yep, totally separate.
That's a bonus.
Yeah, it's a big bonus, but it's a bonus. That's right.
Listen, we're coming up on a break here, Marilyn, and I'm just thinking whether I want to divulge this now. I think I will. I sort of warned people off the top that there was a possibility that the intrepid aforementioned Ambassador Leo Emil Wanta, who does not do a lot of media, understandably, may actually make his presence known on this program. I was actually even warned that he might unannounced show up at our affiliate station here in Toronto, and I'm looking out the window. I don't see him. I'm told he may show up at the studio back in L.A. We may even have him on the phone. I don't know if he's calling in on his shoe phone or not, but let's see what happens on the other side, whether or not Ronald Reagan's top secret agent, the man who single-handedly brought down the Soviet Union's empire and ended the Cold War, will make an appearance here on Coast. My name is Richard Syrett. Please stay with us. All right, we are talking about what is truly an amazing, and many probably of you listening thinking unbelievable story. The story of Leo Wanta, the $27.5 trillion man, President Ronald Reagan's top secret agent or favorite junkyard dog. And here's the thing. You've probably not heard much about Leo Wanta, and we're trying to explain why it's important that you find out who he is. And it's been said that the only thing standing in the way of life and death for Ambassador Leo Wanta is he knows where the money is hidden, that $27.5 trillion, and the Illuminati banksters do not. Well, we will find out from the horse's mouth more about this story when the intrepid Ambassador Leo Emil Wanta joins us on Coast to Coast AM right after this. Welcome back to Coast AM. Richard Syrett with you. And Marilyn Barnwall, are you still with us?
I am.
Great. Well, listen, I think we have the aforementioned Ambassador Leo Emil Wanta on the line. Ambassador, are you there?
Yes, good morning, everybody.
Well, welcome to Coast. Let me ask you, Ambassador, first of all, do you prefer Leo or Lee?
Well, my mother always called me Lee, and everybody else calls me Leo, and that was my Catholic name. And all the way through grade school, you had to have your St. Leo name, or the nuns would not look at you. But my mother would always call me Lee because that's what she wanted. In fact, my first sister that's older than me was a Sherry Lee, and my brother was a Jeffrey Lee. So Lee was favorite to my mother.
All right. So is Lee? That's Lee?
Fine.
All right. We'll go
real quick for Lee. Real quick.
All right, Lee. It is. Let me ask you, Lee. Have you ever appeared on a sort of a coast-to-coast radio forum like this ever before?
I've never heard of Coast to Coast until the other day because I really don't have time for TV and radio.
But I guess what I'm asking is, have you appeared on a radio forum of this magnitude before, telling your story?
Never. I would not have any time for it, to be frank about it.
All right.
But there were so many serious things going on right now with our country and the world. I figured that people have got to know that we're being ripped off.
So this is an exclusive, really, and we're really pleased that you would take some time and join us. Now, are you? I mentioned coming out of a break earlier, going into a break, that the only thing that's standing between you and a death, I guess, is the fact that you know where this $27.5 trillion was squirreled away, or parts of it anyway, and the Illuminati banksters who want to get their greedy little paws on it, they do not. Is that a fair assessment?
That is true, but I'm not a politician, so I don't care to cooperate with them. Understood.
Marilyn was explaining, your official biographer, was explaining the mechanism by which you raised this $27.5 trillion. And what I'd like for you to explain is where you put that money. And obviously, you're not going to tell us the exact location. But I mean, how does one spread $27.5 trillion in bank accounts around the world and keep track of it all?
Well, first of all, I can remember everything I do and the certain codes. And when I have cash, the banks respect me for cash. Not me, the person. The fact that I represented that if I said I would do A, B, and C, I would do A, B, and C. Pronto.
But you also utilized the Promise software, did you not, to keep track of it?
I have 4 units to Promise. Software is created by Inslaw in Washington, D.C., and it's a great electronic facilitator, shall we say. We can track anything coming and going, and where you move it, we can kind of debit your account as well, because we like you.
The $27.5 trillion, was it always understood? Was there an agreement between yourself and President Reagan that the bulk of that money was to be returned to the U.S. Treasury to serve the American people?
Not necessarily U.S. Treasury, but to serve the American people in any shape or form, whatever they needed for the veterans, the VA, because if it gets into Congress, you have no control over it. If it gets into Treasury, the Federal Reserve has control of it, and the Federal Reserve, to me, does not exist. It's a criminal enterprise. They know it, and I know it. And the fact that they know it, it bothers me because they don't do anything to protect the people that they're allegedly working for, because the Federal Reserve system is owned by major banks. So when they give the bailout money, they're ordered by the banks to give them the bailout money free of charge, no interest rates, and you don't have to pay it back, not even a loan. And under a Constitution, if I am the Federal Reserve, and I give you money, you have to give me something back, like a loan agreement. You just can't just take it and say thank you and drop dead. It's all illegal. It's unlawful. And when Henry Paulson, Secretary of the Treasury, told Congress, if you don't give all this bailout to me for all his friends and banks and associates, also foreign banks, you're going to have martial law and civil disturbances and marching on the streets and mayhem and bloodsetting. To me, that's an act of treason because he lied to Congress, and Congress has not the authority to give the Federal Reserve a single dime without some kind of collateral agreement that the Federal Reserve would give it back. Federal Reserve's a clearinghouse. They're not a bank. They're not an agency. They never were, and they never will be. It's a private enterprise.
The $27.5 trillion that was to come back to the American people to be used. Well, listen, we have the U.S. debt now somewhere north of $17 trillion, not including unfunded liabilities.
Yeah, but that's not true, because that debt means nothing. You have no debt obligations.
That's right.
It's fiat currency. It's not real. It's a computer thing. It's not in hard currency, and it's in fiat currency, so it means it's a moral debt. It's zero out. It's ridiculous.
Okay, so regardless, I mean, that $27.5 trillion could be put to very good use in the U.S. You talk about
absolutely, but on sane programs and projects, not some kind of set-aside allocation for certain people to get a piece of the pie. There is no pie for them. If it's not good for the American people, it's never going to happen.
All right, and Marilyn, please jump in here at any point to help sort of further this story along. But when did this start to go south for not only you, but for this massive amount of money? When did things start to go terribly wrong?
Well, if you want me to tell you, when George Bush Sr. went to Singapore for his going away from going back from his office, which was never duly elected to, because of the plea bargain with his grandfather, Prescott Bush. None of the Bushes have any authority or are able to run under the plea bargain in Prescott Bush for any duly elected office.
That was under the Trading with the Enemies Act.
Correct, at the United Banking and Herbert and all that, because they agreed that no Bush would ever run for election because that's how he got out of jail. And all of a sudden they forget about it because they take the opinion that from administration to administration is only a temporary political thing, and that's wrong. We're not a political state. We are a constitutional republic. So Senior came to Singapore, saying goodbye. I was part of his travel arrangements in Singapore. He was going to stay at this, I think it was owned by United or something like that, and I had a cockroach in my sandwich, and I told the Secret Service I was in my suite, we're not going to send him there. We're going to go to Shangri-La or something. And he said, well, I made all these plans for speeches. I'm talking about where he's going to live, where he's going to sleep, and where he's going to be safe without a cockroach in his sandwich. So we had my Chinese partner, who knows everybody in Singapore because he grew up in Singapore. His dad was a warlord in China. And he got us booked, not us, but the president, booked all of his people into the Shangri-La, and everybody in Shangri-La went somewhere else because we kind of threw them out. And I was at the manor at the Secret Service so we could watch what was going on, and I was all the events at the Shangri-La, and I loved it there because I ate there all the time on Sundays. And Bush talked to Lee Kuan Yew, the Prime Minister of Singapore, and all of a sudden we're going to have pictures taken at the American School with President Bush and Carol Courtney of the State Department, Howie and I. And I said, hey, well, we'll go pictures with President Bush and all that good stuff. He was excited. As soon as we got there, George Bush was screaming at us because he found out that we owned a nickel credit, one share each, which was originally owned by the Prime Minister, Lee Kuan Yew, and his wife, who's also an attorney or a solicitor in Singapore. So Howie's got his one share from Lee Kuan Yew, the Prime Minister, through his father, and I took my money and bought my share from Mrs. Lee Kuan Yew. So he and I own 2 shares of a nickel credit, which is a underwriting facility in Singapore under all the rules and regulations, which meant I have to live in Singapore 6 months and 1 day, or else I cannot be the managing director. Howie is the chairman. We both had 1 share, so we're equal partners. So he comes in and he starts screaming at Howie and I, you guys got $864 billion in a nickel credit. And, okay. Howie goes, why do you know this? Because Lee Kuan Yew was still part of the system, because he would refer some of his friends to us and either gave them a loan or didn't give them a loan, and it wasn't good for us. It wasn't good for Prime Minister either.
If I could just interject, just for clarification. So you're saying that then President Bush, and we're talking about George Herbert Walker Bush,
that we had $84 billion, and he felt he was entitled, since he was my boss, which is not true, and Howie, being a stupid Chinese guy, he should give up his money too. And I, like a scared Polak, shall we say, from Milwaukee, I said, okay, I got $432 billion. Okay, I'll give you $216 billion. Howie jumped out of that chair. He says, you were XYZ. I pay you no more XYZ. And Howie he just went off the rocker. I didn't mind losing $216 billion to be alive. Howie refused to have me even participate with giving Bush $216 billion, which was part of our nickel credit. I grabbed Howie and we went out, and within a week, Howie was dead by rat poison.
Okay, so
me too.
Obviously, very serious allegations, and I have to. You can understand. I have to insist that these are allegations. But they're
not allegations. I was there.
I understand, but you understand my position. I have to.
Oh, I understand your position,
right.
But Howie is dead.
Right.
He was my Chinese blood brother.
I understand. And again, I have to use that term, allegation.
No, I understand.
Well, let me add something too. That the only reason Lee was also not gotten rid of that night was because he didn't do what they, in quotes, expected him to do. He went downstairs, and instead of calling for the Anico Credit Company car, he went out in front of the hotel and took a cab to the hotel when he was called and told that Howie was dying and that he was in Singapore General Hospital. And Lee took a cab rather than calling for the car. And rather than going to the front door of the hospital, the cab driver took him to the emergency room. And when Lee went up to the room where Howie was, the guy who had called him on the telephone said, What are you doing here? And Lee said, What do you mean, what am I doing here? You called me. And go ahead, Lee. I'm sorry, I didn't want to interrupt.
No, that's all right, but I mean, I was shocked. Leo Tessin is one of the top guys of their Homeland Security. And he said, what are you doing here? How did you get up here? I said, what? You called me. What are you talking about? And about 10 minutes later, his wife showed up, and she didn't care one iota if he was dead or alive, my impression. And she gave Lee Townsend all his security cards because he was also a warrant officer in their intelligence in Singapore. And I was the only guy that all shook up.
So after the fall of the Berlin Wall and the collapse of the Soviet Empire and the end of the Cold War, you're at this point trying to get this money back to the U.S. to serve the American people.
Repatriation.
To repatriate it.
Right.
Yeah.
Now,
I'm coming home. I'm tired.
But in addition to the assassination attempt, there were trumped-up charges brought against you. You were actually kidnapped at one point. I'd like to get into that. Now,
kidnapped, pressured.
We've got about 4.5 minutes to the bottom of the hour, at which time we'll break. But let's start that discussion. Talk to me about what happened to you when you were in Switzerland and the arrest warrant there.
Okay, Bill Sessions, the FBI director, through Bill Lucates, the resident agent in charge in Nashville, says, as long as you're going to be out there, serve this on Mark Rich. Okay, for tax evasion. Okay, no big deal. I don't know Mark Rich from Adam because he's Mark Rich and I have a arrest warrant for him. So what? Big deal.
Mark Rich was the last person that President Clinton pardoned before he left office.
Well, I knew it now, but at that time, to me, it's just another photograph and a file. He's income tax evasion and trading with and bribery and trading with the enemy. That's a normal pickup, shall we say? So we were going to take him across in the ferry to the casinos in France, but I had Lorraine Fine, who is LH Finance, working with us on a number of programs and prime bank guarantees and things, and we were at the Hotel Arlock in Lausanne, and she was there with her daughter. Giovanni Farrell was there as my consul general for Somalia, and Vince Foster. I was told by Laura DeAndrea Tyson, the chairperson of the White House, the Economic Council at the White House, to give Vince Foster $250 million in financial instruments made out to the Children's Defense Fund. Children's Defense Fund sounds pretty cool to me since I love children.
This was a favorite Clinton charity.
I don't know. Well, yeah, it was a charity. I didn't know Mrs. Clinton was a chairman. How would I know that at that time?
Right.
All I know is make out that through Credit Suisse, $250 million par value of financial instruments, which would be prime bank guarantees in this case, and I had the bank courier do it so I don't get knocked off between Lausanne and Geneva. And then I had breakfast with Giovanni and Lorraine Fine and her daughter and some other very important people. And we were going to be moving into the Hotel de la Paix at Vince Foss's request because we were on his American Express card, and he and I were on the same floor. Other people of my staff and his staff were probably on other floors, but he and I were going to be on the same floor. So we were going to go to Hotel de la Paix in Geneva, and I had breakfast with everybody, and by the time I got up from breakfast, the Syrett decided that they wanted to entertain me for 134 days in a Swiss dungeon with no charges or nothing.
Well, we should point out at this point, excuse me, Lee, we should point out at this point that you had diplomatic immunity because you had been appointed the Somalian ambassador to Switzerland and Canada at this time,
right, and
you were traveling on that diplomatic passport.
Not one, but two of them. One for Canada and one for Switzerland. And I also had my documents that I was the chairman of the Somalia Central Bank. And I had 167 tons of gold bullion warehouse receipts from Somalia because the banks in Switzerland wanted to buy it at a 8% discount. And I told President Haji, that's ridiculous. We'll take a loan against it. And that's why they appointed me the chairman of the central bank, is why give up hard gold when you could take a loan about it and then buy it back or pay off the loan? You still own the gold. 167 tons of gold wasn't too shabby.
But my question, I guess, and I guess it's an obvious one, the answer is an obvious one, but why, if you have diplomatic immunity, you had the diplomatic passports, why would the Swiss police detain you, arrest you, interrogate you for several days without...
134 days.
Without investigating?
No charges filed, by the way, Richard. No charges filed ever. And I've been in contact with the lawyers, with the judges, with everyone in Lausanne, Switzerland, in that court system, and have never gotten an answer to that question of why was he arrested. He was arrested because the state of Wisconsin filed UFAP, Flight to Avoid Prosecution, for the payment of taxes, which was totally unreal. I've got the copies of the paid checks that cleared the bank, $14,129 that were paid twice in 1992, once in May and once in June. So the taxes that they were saying that they had filed this UFAP on, the Flight to Avoid Prosecution on, had already been paid more than a year earlier, because he was arrested on 7 July 1993, and those bills were paid in May and June of 1992.
And even if they hadn't been paid...
It was signed by a cabinet secretary of the state of Wisconsin Department of Revenue.
That's right.
That's how serious this case was.
But
even if
Wisconsin has no authority beyond their border.
That's what I was going to ask you.
The question is, it was totally in violation of the Vienna Conventions for them to arrest him, number one. Number two, have you ever heard of any European nation arresting an American citizen because they owe taxes in the United States? I don't think so.
All right, got to take a time out. Lee, Emil, Wanta, stay with us. Marilyn Barnwall as well, the official biographer. Back with more of our discussion about the $27.5 trillion man right here, an exclusive on Coast to Coast AM.
Coast to Coast AM. Now, here's your guest host, Richard Syrett.
Welcome back. Let me share again some of the words of Marilyn Barnwall in her official biography of Leo Emil Wanta. Again, this is Marilyn speaking. Whenever I talk or write about Ambassador Leo Wanta, I know people will scoff. I know they'll shake their heads in disbelief. Good heavens, they say. No one man has ever created a $27.5 trillion fortune. And when I talk about Leo Wanta, I know I'm placing myself in danger. The people who stole Leo Wanta's money money that belongs to the American people largely, have held the highest offices in the land, in the political and intelligence worlds, and in our system of justice, in our courts, and in our Congress and our military. They don't like having this story told. This is the life story of a real man, a story that challenges anything Ian Fleming ever wrote about a man called James Bond. We'll talk more with Marilyn Barnwall and the man in question, Ronald Reagan's top secret agent, Ambassador Leo Wanta, when Coast to Coast AM continues in a moment. We are back. Leo Emil Wanta is with us, the $27.5 trillion man, and also Marilyn Barnwall, the official biographer, exclusive biographer of Leo Wanta, and the author of Wanta, Black Swan, White Hats. Now, I want to talk just a bit about Ronald Reagan here, President Reagan. It's always been my understanding, Lee, and you can correct me if or disabuse me of this, that was a total outsider coming into Washington and thought in big, bold ideas. And, of course, you would know that firsthand, having pulled off perhaps one of the biggest and boldest ideas ever. But that he was such an outsider, the establishment thought he was such a wild card, they had to have someone supervising him. And that was why Vice President George Bush was sort of foisted upon him on that ticket. Is that an accurate assessment?
It was George Herbert Walker Bush that insisted that he would bring in a big block of votes. And remember, he was the director of the CIA. So they were not going to give up any control to somebody that absolutely refused to be a politician.
Now, how was it that you were, I understand that you were sort of a free agent, you weren't under the employ of the CIA, but you were working under Reagan. When Reagan left office, now you're working under George Bush. You're very suspicious of him, and he's suspicious of you. I mean, how do you continue to work in that type of situation and operate as an intelligence agent with your neck out on the line out there?
Let me explain. President Reagan left office January 20th, 1989. George Bush has no eligibility to be the President of the United States. In fact, he went out of his way to fly to California in front of Nancy Reagan, told President Reagan, and I got it from both of them, that he was no longer the president, but out. You stay out of this, stay out of that, don't get involved in everything else. And President Reagan made it very clear, at least to me, and I know others had conversations with him, that there was nobody that replaced him. So therefore, the office is vacant. So therefore, everybody who was in the Reagan administration would continue until there was a duly elected president. Because under the agreements with Prescott Bush and his plea bargaining, none of the Bushes could run for public office. So the job was vacant, which can't be vacant because President Reagan really didn't leave, and that's why he said continue, continue, continue. Because theoretically, by law in our constitutional republic, it's not a vacant. You still have to hold the job until you're replaced. He's never been legally replaced.
So, in other words, some of Reagan's administration were watching your back.
Absolutely, still are today. A lot of us guys, we've never been fired, we've never been pushed out, and we refuse to work for them because they really legally and technically have no legal standing.
All right, back to the location of the $27.5 trillion and their attempts there, and when I say there, let's just call them the banksters, if you will, or the rogue elements of the United States government, rogue, emphasis on rogue, their attempts to get that information out of you. So I guess they tried to do it by imprisoning you, pressuring you. They could have easily have killed you, I suppose, but then they wouldn't have access to that money. So we left off in Switzerland, where you were imprisoned for, was it 134 days?
134 days, and I call it Suite 130. And the only reason I was released because President Reagan funded a 1992 peace accord between the Israelis and Palestine. And Yitzhak Rabin, who I knew myself, found finally where I was located, and he sent a letter to the Swiss administration that I better be released. He's going to come over there and steal me away from them. Because the 1992 peace accord was $10 billion, 5 for the Palestinians, 5 for the Israelis. They were restricted funds. You couldn't use them for arms and ammunition and other. It had to go to the infrastructure for the people, and we would have made sure that happened. But in reality, they'll just move the money around somewhere else, and we'll still do what we want to do, but they'll be hiding other blank checks. That's how they operate.
So Rabin tried to intercede. Now, eventually, you ended up...
He did intercede.
He did. In fact, let me make a point. One of the pictures that I put in the text, Richard, in Chapter 8, was a copy of the envelope where it's stamped. Rabin's letter is stamped as having been received by the Swiss on November 16, 1993. And they had him on an airplane back to the United States on November 17th, the next day.
And
so he was in New York, in New York court on November 17th. He went into court under Federal District Magistrate Judge Aline Ross, and she dismissed all charges.
As spurious and subterfuge.
That's right.
And you left the courthouse thinking you were a free man, but then what happened?
I wasn't thinking I was free. The U.S. attorney that was hearing my case advised the judge to dismiss all the charges, get them out of here. Because she asked me a very simple question. Mr. Ambassador, please explain why you have this $1 billion security note from the United States. And he jumped right out of that chair. Surprised he didn't throw the briefcase at her. We dismiss all the charges. Motion to dismiss. I left free. I was free. I'm going back to see my kids.
So the prosecutor didn't want to get into the minutia and reveal what had really been going on. So they dismissed the case.
He was scared to death.
They didn't want his testimony on record in court in New York in response to the judge's question, Richard.
I loved the question because it was paid for.
What happened when you left the courthouse almost immediately?
I was walking down the steps, going to a hotel or wherever I want to go because they had everything on me. And 2 New York detectives came up to me and said, Mr. Wanta, we have a phone call from the state of Wisconsin Department of Revenue to hold you. I said, what for? I just been dismissed. Well, please come with us. And they took me to where they filmed on Serpico. They had me handcuffed to a pipe there, and then they bought me a soda and some potato chips while I was in the booking. And when we went downstairs for the booking, they told everybody that I was arrested for murder. So everybody would leave me alone or kill me, either choice. I don't know. And I go, murder? Murder who?
Oh, my.
They scared the hell because they have a big booking group down there. This man's here for murder. I don't know what he gave the form, but they put me in the Brooklyn House of Detention.
Yeah.
And which was funny as hell because the Secret Service came and talked to Captain Madigan, told him I was an ambassador. They, in front of him, who took me down to the security office with 2 Secret Service guys there, they had a gag order for me, a presidential gag order for me to sign, and I could be free to leave and go wherever I wanted to go just to get out of sight and out of mind. And I made a simple question. Which president do you represent? The guy almost ripped off his fingernails slamming that briefcase down. And Captain Madigan says, what the hell is that all about? Beats the hell out of me. I guess I don't know who authorized the gag order.
Well, at any point, is someone asking or suggesting to you that you can go free if you give them the security codes for these bank accounts containing...
Oh, I got that from Bush and those guys clowns all the time. I call them clowns, and I'm trying to be polite. In fact, the state of Wisconsin, they would release me immediately if I would give them all of the accounts. It was in the Alford plea proposal. Right. My trial would stop dead in its tracks if I would assist them returning all this money to whoever. And why would I do that? I could have walked out of the state of Wisconsin immediately, and they would have took me to all my banks and got their collections.
In fact, Richard, in that Alford plea, it very clearly states, and that is published in the book, that if as part of that agreement, he had to list all of his assets everywhere in the world.
Right.
Now,
and if I violated even one of them, I go back to trial.
Yeah, I mean, it was an obvious,
shakedown.
threat. Yeah, shakedown. Good word.
And then at some point you're transferred to a prison in Oklahoma.
Oh, yeah, and that's because CIA General Counsel Morton Hager came to Kettle Moraine Prison to interview me, and he must have said something to the warden, because he was CIA. He was the chief counsel for the CIA, Jan Morton Hager, and he was the attorney I used to buy the Ionian Bank in Greece. I gave him $500 million for a bid bond, and we won the bid. So I would have owned the bank in Greece, so we wouldn't have had all the default in Greece, because I would have moved a lot of cash up there just to protect the country. And at 3:15 in the morning, they woke me up and took me down to like where the bus comes in to take you. I'm going to Oklahoma, and the prison lieutenant says, "I don't know what's going on," and he gave me a big hug. He says, "I know who you are." I said, "I know who I am too," and he and I are still the best of friends. So for 24, 25 hours, I'm on a school bus going down to Oklahoma. Wow, I'm going to Oklahoma. You can't take me out of the border. The state of Wisconsin can't send a prisoner to any place except the state of Wisconsin.
They were trying to bury you.
Oklahoma.
They were trying to bury you
down there.
How did they do that? How did they try to get you killed?
In chains and shackles, and away I go.
But was there a hit order on you while you were in prison?
Well, 3 guys came into my private cell. I was the only guy in that prison with a own private cell. They came in. There were 3 guys, and one guy's stroking himself. He's going to rape and plunder me. And I was sleeping, and they banged my head against the cement wall. And that got me mad. I thought I was back in Vietnam. So I figured, okay, 3 characters. And I got rid of 2 real quick. And the 3rd guy was hanging over the railing on the 2nd floor, and the sergeant kept running up. Wanta, don't drop. Sarge, he ain't going nowhere. He took his feet, and I had him such a headlock he wasn't going anywhere. And after that, because the people in the unit, which was 94% black, knew I was the ambassador representing Somalia. So they were my protection. But the guard down there unlocked my door electronically, and they came in. And he's got this alam, he's stroking, what?
Well, and the bitter irony of all this is that despite being worth $27.5 trillion, you couldn't even pay for your own lawyer. You had a court-appointed lawyer who really didn't know anything about your case.
But I'm not entitled. He was never appointed. He was only appointed to put me in a medical institution so they could put me forever drugged.
That's right. They appointed this man to see Lee through the
mental
judge
evaluation.
And the prosecutor, Douglas Haig, Judge Torpy and Douglas Haig, the prosecutor, wanted Lee to have mental evaluations. They wanted to get him in a funny farm where they could control the money and drug him to get whatever information out of him that they could.
I'd be a ward of the court. I couldn't do nothing.
And meanwhile, while you're buried in prison, Lee, my understanding is that these banksters and this rogue element of the United States government that wanted to get their mitts on your money went around to these foreign banks because they had uncovered some of the cash and were telling the people at the bank, you can turn the money over to us because Lee Wanta is dead. That's why they had buried you in prison. Dead.
But the interesting thing, Dr. Connie Lee, who was the chief psychiatrist of the state of Wisconsin, she came for my first evaluation. I told her where I was, and she probably thought I was nuts. I says, do me a favor. Please, do me a favor, doctor. You don't know me from Adam. You have your files, which I don't know what they are, and I don't care because I don't believe they're true. Please call Vice President Al Gore. I gave her the number 202-456-XXXX, and the moment he picks up the phone, you go, Albert, and he'll know you are calling for me. She called. She kept me outside of her office with 2 guards. She called. She was in the phone about 35 minutes. She came out, says, Mr. Ambassador, would you like a glass of milk, a soda, some cookies? I'm calling the Sheriff's Department. You're not going to stay in here any longer. I don't know what's going on. I don't want any part of it. But the Vice President absolutely said you were dead, and you were, because I appeared in front of the Select Intelligence Committee on many occasions when he was a senator. She says, I don't know what's going on, but you're out of here. You're not insane. You are not bipolar. You could run this place, and I would work for you. I said, well, thank you, doctor.
So she actually dialed the vice president, and he said that you were dead.
Vice President Al Gore.
And he said that you were dead. He said that you were dead.
She was very, very brave, Richard, because she wrote 3 times. 3 times they tried to get this done. And 3 times this doctor stood up and said, no, there is absolutely no mental illness here.
How much of the money? Nuts were in Madison.
How much of the money is still out there, Lee? How much of the $27.5 trillion is still out there in your bank accounts?
Right now, it's $30 trillion. I have a deal with the bilateral tax agreement with Austria and the IMF and the United States. I put this into motion about a year ago, right, Marilyn, something like that?
Right, that's right.
And they agreed, and so there's $30 trillion that they know of. So, in other words, living in Austria, where I lived since June 1988, I'm an Austrian resident by Austrian courts, filings, and everything else, because I was a Director General of New Republic, which required I had to be there running the company. So there's $30 trillion. According to the inland tax laws in Austria, they get a flat 50%. So I told the IMF, Christine Lagarde, to be my escrow agent. Whatever she decides with the United States and Austria for their division, her fees, is half of this $30 trillion. So I would walk out tax-free $15 trillion, and I would be billing high-speed rail and whatever else, the veterans, hospitals, I don't care what. I'm 74 years old in June. I would have spent all that money my way on projects for the people of the United States. Because if I give it to the Treasury Department, it'll go to the Fed Res, it'll go wherever it goes, and I don't know. But with the half or whatever they get of the 15T, that $17 trillion, we claw that back for the bailouts because they're illegal. It's nonsense. We don't have a national debt obligation, $17 trillion. I would even give you more. Plus, me making more progress, I knew in 2006 when my $4.5 trillion was sent to Bank of America in Richmond, I knew within 2 years I would have wiped out your debt. It wasn't $17 trillion at that time. Because I would have made money, and you would have charged me 35% on every transaction. You were a gold digger, but go for it.
What happened to that $4.5 trillion that got wired to the Bank of America?
I accused, through my attorneys, I went to court and everything else, and they said they didn't steal it, they converted the money. The chief counsel of the Federal Reserve Bank in Richmond testified in front of Federal Judge Ellis that everything Ambassador Wanta said was true and correct. They released from the Federal Reserve by $4.5 trillion to Henry Paulson, the Secretary of the Treasury. So we dismissed them as a defendant in the suit, which was 02-1363-A in the federal courts in Richmond. We won, and Judge Ellis and everybody was happy, as Larry, because I was getting my money. I went to Citibank for 2 months waiting for Rubin and Senior to give me my money because the Federal Reserve said he had it. So I'm not going to go back to wherever when I go to Citibank where we know it was there in Goldman Sachs. But they allegedly say they committed no crime. They didn't steal it. It was converted. In other words, I'm not capable of spending my own money.
Now, for those of you, again, who are maybe scoffing at this and thinking this is too unbelievable, we need to point out that all these court documents are embedded in links in your book, Marilyn, right. Wanta, Black Swan, White Hat. Just about a minute here to go before the top of the hour. Explain how people can get a hold of this book online so that they can read it themselves.
Right. There are 2 ways, actually. It is online at Amazon.com on Kindle, because Kindle, and I do want to get it onto ebooks with Barnes & Noble, too. I haven't had time to do that, and because that will let you have access to all of the links and the documents. The other way, anybody who's listening can go to the website that was set up for Ambassador Wanta, and it's called http://, of course, wantarevelations.com.
All right, we'll take a break. We'll take a break. If you're both good to stay with us, we'll open up the lines and take some calls as well, discussing the unbelievable $27.5 trillion man here on Coast to Coast. My name is Richard Syrett. Don't you dare go away. And a world exclusive in conversation with President Ronald Reagan's top secret agent, Ambassador Emil Wanta, and his official biographer, Marilyn Barnwall. And more of Marilyn's words: it's not an easy task to write about a covert intelligence operative. The entire purpose of such a person's life is secrecy. Finding facts that support the story can be difficult. I know, because I've spent years digging them up, researching them, and either abandoning them or trying to figure out just where in this complicated story they belong. Here are some things to keep in mind as you read this book. This is the man who, by bringing down the Soviet Union ruble, caused the Iron Curtain and the Berlin Wall to come tumbling down. This is the man who generated the largest fortune ever amassed by one person, with the intent of giving almost all of it to his country, to America. Leo Wanta created a $27.5 trillion fortune and wants to give $23 trillion of it to you, to pay off the irresponsible debt of the Federal Reserve and numerous corrupt politicians, debt that was created as a means to tear down our republic. You may hear reference to the Wanta-Reagan-Mitterrand protocols. Those funds represent money Wanta has personally agreed to pay from his own funds, the $4.5 trillion he earned in contract agreements with the United States government for risking his life day to day for so many years in service to his government. He wasn't paid a salary. He worked by contract agreement, and the $4.5 trillion represents funds due him for 30 years of very dangerous work. From that sum, Wanta has agreed to pay billions of dollars to several European nations. Most notably, $30 billion goes to the Russian Federation. Other nations involved in the protocols include $5 billion each to the governments of Canada, France, Germany, Greece, Italy, Mexico, and Spain. The protocols will settle the rocky financial market so close to failure in Europe, and that, in turn, will go a long ways towards settling the markets of the United States. The point is, when he served as President Ronald Reagan's personal intelligence coordinator, Leo Wanta promised Reagan he would bring down the Soviet Union ruble, which he did, and he would save the profits from the endeavor to pay America out of debt when the overspending crooks in government put the nation into bankruptcy. That would be now. More of my conversation with Leo Emil Wanta, Marilyn Barnwall, and your calls when Coast to Coast continues right after this. Ambassador Leo Emil Wanta stays with us, along with his official biographer, Marilyn Barnwall. And before we take calls, and the lines are full, if you've got a line, hold on to it, and we'll try to work through as many calls as we can. But let me ask you this, and Marilyn and Lee, whoever wants to field this question, just jump right in. I'm thinking that this Title 18 type of corporation that was set up under Reagan's executive order, if that's still operational, there could be hundreds of Leo Wantas out there running these corporations. And if you could almost single-handedly yourself, Leo, bring down the Soviet economy with the proceeds from these Section 18 companies, there could be other rogue elements, other rogue versions of Leo Wanta out there doing it to the United States.
I have no doubt of that.
Yeah, and in fact, that was, I probably should answer that to some degree. Lee's obviously welcome to, but because that was my conclusion. That was something that was my opinion, and it was not something that was Lee's opinion or that he and I had talked about. But as I looked at that, and I looked at the number, it's Title 18, Section 6 companies that that Lee had formulated and had created these huge profits from. And that really what happened when the People's Bank of China, wire transferred, or SWIFT wire transferred an inland remittance to Lee to his Bank of America account in Richmond, Virginia, and it was removed and disappeared down a black hole. what that did was said to all those other people, don't bring your money back into the United States, because if you do, the government's going to take it.
So is it fair to say that this is the way now that wars are being waged, and maybe that you set the template during the final days of the Cold War, Lee, but is this the way wars are fought now, essentially currency wars behind the stage, behind the backstage?
Well, yeah, because they don't trust us anymore. We had a general agreement of cooperation between the Russian Federation, New Republic, which represented the United States, and the Russian Federation represented all their satellites and everybody else, signed by Gorbachev, got $10 billion, and he retired to the Gorbachev Foundation in Geneva and the Presidio in California. Yeltsin appointed Yegor Gadar to be, the vice chairman of RUSS, and I'm the vice chairman of RUSS on behalf of the United States, which means we own a lot of property. We collectively in the Russian Federation, and we agree we're not going to provoke, we're not going to steal, we're not going to lie, we're not going to create problems between our countries. And the first thing we got now, we're provoking trouble in Syria with our own money, and we're provoking trouble in the Ukraine, because under the General Agreement on Cooperation, which I believe is in the book, if not, we can send you a copy, we're supposed to get along with everybody. And the politicians don't care because they take the position, well, that was the Reagan administration, who cares? Well, I care, because that was an agreement. It was a special agreement to have peace between the Soviet Union, now called the Russian Federation, and the United States, which is a constitutional republic and not some banana republic. It was a good deal. Reagan was happy. I was happy. Casey was happy. Everybody's happy. And we blew it. They don't trust us anymore. They know that the multinationals are trying to beat them up, and the military-industrial complex. Everybody needs a boogeyman out there. We cannot afford a boogeyman. We got rid of that boogeyman when we destabilized the Soviet Union. It was a paper war. No shots were fired. Everybody was happy, and the Soviet Union left us, and the Russian Federation had a new lease on life. And we became the fools by letting the politicians say, I don't care what Reagan did. That was his administration. This is a new life, the new world order. That's bogus. That's unlawful and stupid and immature.
Well, I don't want to digress. I don't want to digress, too much and go down this road. But I just find it interesting the way that Vladimir Putin has been demonized and portrayed as another Adolf Hitler. And I'm wondering how we might react if, let's say, for example, the tables were turned and the Russians were trying to put nuclear missiles in Guatemala or Cuba. Oh, wait a minute. We already suffered through that.
We already went past that one.
Yeah.
All right. Let's go to the wild card line and say hello to Lon Gibby in Spokane, Washington. Lon, welcome to Coast to Coast.
Hi, Richard. How are you?
Well, thank you, sir.
Well, Lon Gibby, welcome. I am so glad to hear your name. Richard, Lon Gibby is the president of a company that is taking the biography of Lee Wanta and turning it into a documentary film. Thanks for calling, Lon. I am so happy you did.
You bet. I've really enjoyed the conversation, and it's been you guys have been very focused, and I thought you did a great job explaining it.
All right, Lon. Well, I appreciate you joining us. And did you have a question or comment? Well, first of all, before you do, when is this documentary set to be released?
Well, our goal is to get it out, in time for the election, and I'd like to just say, it's an honor for me. I'm a storyteller, a documentarian, produced documentaries on a lot of different subjects, including mountain climbing and as well as the Vietnam War, and I'm really interested in seeing this get out as soon as possible because it's such a great story. It's very positive if you consider where this could lead to and how it could affect our country. It can make a major positive difference in our future for all our future generations here in our country, and it also affect other countries as well in a positive way. So I'm very excited to tell a story, and and get it out. And we've got a lot of support. Different organizations are willing to help us and with getting some of the content that we need. And the content has to be accurate. It's got to be told unbiased, in an unbiased way, and with no hidden agenda. And that's what we intend to do. We just want it to be the truth.
Very dangerous subject material here, Lon. Any obstacles in getting a documentary about this story distributed?
Well, the nice thing about it is Marilyn Barnwall just worked her heart out to get all of this stuff together. It's already public knowledge. Anybody could read this material. It's all available, and the links behind it. So all we're doing is basically using her research as a foundation, and then just adding some great visual content. I was in the Soviet Union in 1988, the same time Lee was there producing a documentary on culinary. It was a culinary exchange between our two countries, where a group of food professionals were there, and it was to help join our countries together, and glasnost and perestroika. And I saw what it was like in the Soviet Union during that time period when everything was changing, and we captured about 40 hours of very unique footage that will be helpful to add B-roll to make this very interesting. So we just want it to be interesting and visuals to back it up. And of course, Marilyn has done the job of putting together the content, which is the foundation for the documentary, which again is available to anybody. So it's not a dangerous subject because it's really out there. Anybody could read it. We just want to put it together in a format that people can enjoy, because people like video now. It's the preferred way of getting information. Video is growing on the internet as well. As you know, 70% of all content comes video. So
what's it going to be called, Lon?
It's Eagle One to Wanta is the title of it. And Eagle One is the president's code name, and what he was known as, and to Wanta. And of course, you're meeting Wanta tonight, which is exciting.
Yeah. Absolutely. Well, listen, Lon, we look forward to seeing Eagle One to Wanta. And is there a website where people can find out more about the documentary, or perhaps even view a trailer or something?
Well, we have a trailer in production right now, and with some very selected information that we have, and it'll be available on a website shortly, and we just haven't announced that yet. So you're one of the first to hear about it.
I appreciate that. We'll be standing by and awaiting more details on Eagle One to Wanta. Lon Gibby, filmmaker from Spokane, Washington. Thank you for that, Lon.
Thank you very much. Appreciate the time to be with you.
God bless, Lon.
He raised an interesting point, and that is the condition inside the newly minted Russian Federation after the Berlin Wall came tumbling down and the demise of the Soviet Empire. And rather than simply walk away with your ill-gotten gains, Lee, and allowing who were the Cold War enemy to suffer, you kind of pulled off a massive humanitarian mission with a lot of those profits. Tell me about that.
Well, we plan to give them $30 billion right back. We were going to rebuild. I'm the co-chair or vice chair. We both share Yeager Dart, their former prime minister, and myself, to rebuild, because they were going to bring in more ag, no more arms races. They were going to have the postal workers get involved in the military and ag production and teachers. It was just no more fighting, no more pitchforks.
But in the immediate aftermath, did you not use some of your money to import cheap American goods, staples that the people in Russia needed to prevent starvation?
Oh, we were doing that all the time. In fact, we had the contract for powder milk from Austria. The only meat contracts, we had to go through Warsaw because they had the distribution rights, apparently, and I wasn't going to object to that. And we had the halal chicken coming from the United States out there. We were going to build a Wonder Bread facility, ICC Continental Baking, and we had stuff going through Kimberly Clark and everything on feminine products and stuff of that nature. And we were trying to do everything. In fact, we sent them a tremendous amount of horses from Mexico. What they did with them, we have no idea. But we made the deal with them. We made a lot of deals with them. They were good people. And Putin is not. See, you have to understand, Putin was invited to go back to the Ukraine by the duly elected president, like YAKON, whatever. But they were requested under the general agreement of cooperation to support the Ukraine because they were being attacked. And we know for a fact, and the Assistant Secretary of State, Victoria Nuland, went with Chevron and everything in a presentation how she bragged that she spent $5 billion of the U.S. taxpayers' money to rearrange Ukraine. We have no authority to rearrange Ukraine. Who are we? We're Americans. We're not Ukrainians. Is that not a
violation of the Boland Act?
Absolutely.
Yeah,
and they're paying for the protesters and the terrorists and giving them arms. And you got John McCain, which is really a strange. We ever released the papers on him. Everybody wants to provoke wars. What for? For the multinational oil companies and the pipelines. Let the people do their own lives.
It's a pretty unsavory bunch that took part in that coup. When you talk about Svoboda and the right sector,
right.
this ultra right. Many of these individuals are neo-Nazis.
Yes.
And it's very disturbing that the West would be throwing their lot in with this rather unsavory bunch, to say the least.
Because nobody's in charge.
Let's say hello to Michael, east of the Rockies, calling from Virginia Beach, Virginia. Michael, welcome to Coast.
Thank you so much. First of all, I want to say you're the only person that's ever come to this microphone that could replace John B. Wells as an equal. Thank you for your wonderful, wonderful interviews. Ambassador Hunton, I know you won't want me to hang on. I am one of the greatest cross-examiners in the world. Here's the problem. You say you want $4.5 trillion for your years of suffering. Was that 30 years you said?
No.
I said that.
The Bank of China, People's Public Bank of China, from my reserves in China, sent $4.5 trillion to the Bank of America in Richmond. I'm not asking for anything that I don't own. I'm the principal.
Okay, but you said for your 30 years of suffering. That comes out to
never
100?
said 30 years. I never even counted.
He did not say that. I did.
Okay,
number one. And number two, basically...
Okay, well, let me please make my point and ask the question.
Okay.
Whatever the years were, if it was 30, whether it was more or less, it doesn't matter. If it was 30, it's $150 billion a year, which you want to be paid. I happen to know prisoners of war here in the Hampton Roads area who suffered tremendously in several wars. Now, they aren't getting anywhere near $150 billion a year for their suffering, but I'm sure they suffered a whole lot more than you did. Now, here's the
Where
problem.
do you get $150 billion a year I'm getting? That was what I needed for the trust to purchase rubles and exchange rubles.
Your payback for your suffering, you said, is this $4.5 trillion. I heard you say it, and I take it.
That's what I earned from my share of my production.
The problem here is...
Michael, I think there's an important distinction.
From a total lack of understanding of anything, that this was a transfer that was done as a result of a court order by Judge Gerald Bruce Lee, who told Ambassador Wanta to liquidate corporations, which he did.
I understand that perfectly.
And $4.5 trillion of that money from the liquidation of Lee Wanta's corporations was SwiftWire transferred to Ambassador Wanta. It was his money, and he was doing precisely what he was ordered by the court to do.
His own testimony tells us that it wasn't his money because he said that you can't take money from the people of the United States without a note, without some instruments for payback. He has produced nothing of that kind. He is in the same category of crook as the people that he's accusing. And I want to talk to this man after the break so we can get some serious questioning in here and not give him the cover-up that he's looking for.
All right, Michael, you've said your piece now. Let's take a time out. when we come back, excuse me, I'll have Lee address that directly, and then we'll move on. You're not going to monopolize the program. There are other people calling in. You've raised some questions. They will be addressed on the other side. More of my conversation with Lee, Emil, Wanta, and Marilyn Barnwall when Coast to Coast continues after this.
To talk to Richard Syrett, call the wildcard line at 818-501-4109. The first-time caller line is 818-501-4721. To talk to Richard from east of the Rockies, call 800-825-5033. From west of the Rockies, toll-free, call 800-618-8255. International callers may reach Richard by calling their in-country Sprint access number, pressing option 5, and dialing toll-free 800-893-0903. This is Coast to Coast AM with your guest host, Richard Syrett.
Dorothy Moore and Misty Blue just arrived in time with that angelic voice to calm things down a little bit after a rather inflammatory call from Michael in Virginia Beach. And this is a short segment before we head on into another break. But, Lee, obviously I need you to give you the opportunity to respond.
Richard, I'd like to say something first.
Please,
because
Marilyn,
from my
please.
perspective, this guy's a plant. This guy sounds like a CIA disinformation expert who subscribes to the liberal progressive philosophy of if you can't find anything wrong with the story and all the documentation is in place, attack the individual. And that, Lee can say what he wants to, but I had to say that.
All right, Lee, go ahead.
And I would say if that Michael is suggesting that I don't repatriate the money because I'm a lawful resident of Austria since June 1988, I support my country, my fellow Americans. If I want to give everything to Austria, I would have. These occasions would never have started. I would have just been quietly being in Vienna, Austria, a big home, and forget about the United States. I can't do that. I have my family here. I have my grandkids. And I have my friends. And Reagan preached over and over. He supported our fellow Americans, and I don't want to stay in Austria and not pay U.S. taxes. I'm an American since 1940. Why should I have to move?
He seemed to be implying that that $4.5 trillion, which was wired to the Bank of America, that somehow you were taking that as salary, but it couldn't be salary because you weren't working for the CIA.
Correct.
Those are your assets, and I don't know if it's a bit of class envy on his part or what, but I mean, you would be entitled to that money, but your intention.
already ruled I'm entitled to it.
Right.
Well, I mean, the fact that the intent with the $4.5 trillion was to pay $1.575 trillion in taxes, number one, and number two, to build a national high-speed rail system for the American people with no tax dollars involved, totally makes what he says ridiculous, number one. And number two, calling with quotes that weren't quotes at all. I heard you say that. No, he didn't. Lee did not say that. I didn't even say it.
And we're talking 2 million jobs, and the veterans are very much involved.
That's right.
We have all the details worked out to start pronto. I started this in 1995, and I'm still waiting to get started.
Well, let me ask you one quick question, and then we'll head into a break and come back and take some calls. What is the likelihood? I mean, what are you doing now in terms of trying to get that money repatriated. What is the likelihood that that's going to happen within your lifetime, Lee?
Very good. Very good indeed. The only thing is, I agree with Judge Lee to pay 35%. Repatriation tax could be between 5 and 10. Am I objecting? No. 35% to get this settled was fine with me. Other people repatriate money at 5 and 10%. Corporations don't even repatriate at all. I'm paying a big premium to come back to the American people. Am I complaining? No.
What is the likelihood, though, that the tax from those trillions of dollars won't just end up down a black hole anyway?
I can't stop whatever they do with the taxes. I can only know and control my 65%. Once it goes to the Treasury as an American, as well as you and Marilyn, we have a voice of how they spend our money. We thought we had a voice, but apparently we don't count.
All right, let's take a time out. When we come back, we'll get to Pete in Pittsburgh, Christian in L.A., Stan in Denver, Doug in Des Moines, and John in Tampa. You got a line? Hold on to it. Back with more of my conversation with Marilyn Barnwall, the official biographer of the $27.5 trillion man who's also in the House. Coast to Coast AM, stay with us. Welcome back to Coast AM. Richard Syrett here. Say hello on Twitter at Richard Syrett, the website, richardsyrett.com. And the $27.5 trillion man, Lee Wanta, stays with us, as does his official and exclusive biographer, Marilyn Barnwall, the author of Wanta, Black Swan, White Hat. And again, Marilyn, how do people access this? It's essentially an e-book because there are so many links embedded in there containing court documents and so forth. It would be impossible to publish this as a hardcover book. So it's available online. How do people get a hold of it?
That's right. They can go to Amazon.com and they can input my last name if they want, Barnewall, Barnewall, or they can input the name of the book, Wanta, ! Black Swan, White Hat. And it will come up, and it'll cost $9.95 that way, or they can have access to it at no charge at Lee's website, which is http://wantarevelations.com, and just look for the name of the book under the banner and click on it.
All right. Before we get to Pete in Pittsburgh and other callers, Lee, who at this point is on your side in terms of the current administration that's helping you repatriate this money? Or do you have any friends in Washington?
Well, we have been talking to some senators and some governors. We sent them letters. We have a lot of friends, but they're waiting to see which way the flag is going to go, too, because they know our country is bankrupt. They know there's a lot of shady deals going on, and they're very concerned, but they're more concerned for their family and their future than everybody else's. I'm concerned for everybody's future. I'm 74. This is all I got left.
Given the state of the U.S. economy, and I follow shadow stats, I believe that the real unemployment rate is probably close to 20%. When you look at the number of people on food stamps and the labor participation rate and so forth, inflation is probably much higher, maybe 10%. We could be staring hyperinflation in the face. At some point, do you think that they're just going to hit the reset button and devalue the currency and sort of inflate the debt away? Or how do you think this is going to play out?
Well, first of all, a dollar is still a dollar, but we don't have a dollar. We have a Federal Reserve note. We got to get rid of the Federal Reserve, stop printing money we don't have, and then we have to pay interest on money that they didn't give away, but they charge us for it anyway. We have to claw back all the money on the bailouts and the stimulus money. And if the banks go under, that's too bad, because they're the ones that take bailout money, buy our treasuries, and they make 2.5%. The money doesn't go to the people. It's just a transaction between their buddies. This is all lawful. It's stupid.
All right,
it's illegal.
Let's go to the wild card line. Christian is in Los Angeles. Christian, welcome to Coast. Good morning.
Hey guys, good morning. Hello, Richard. Hello, guests.
Good morning.
I want to put my 25 cents, and I also have a question for you as well. I'm 30 years old, or 39 years old, excuse me. And I've seen that ever since 2008, when the economy and the middle class collapsed, it frightens me. Just what's happened to the country. People just don't feel good anymore. And it's like a lot of people have just lost hope with the country. And it's sad. I mean, the Federal Reserve is unconstitutional. It's been running this country for over 100 years. I feel that one big step to take this country back to the way the Founding Fathers originally intended it is to get rid of the Federal Reserve and the bankers. The bankers are essentially running the country along with corporations. And we, the people, are supposed to be the ones who are supposed to be in control of our destiny, and we are supposed to have the power, and government essentially is supposed to be subservient to us. My question is, you, sir, with your long years of service in government, do you feel there was a report that came out recently from Northwest University that essentially says that a cabal is running our country, is running our government, and essentially we're not a democracy. Do you see any light at the end of the tunnel that this country, that we can essentially be pulled back from the abyss? Or is it literally, it's too late, that it doesn't matter what we do? Look, the Occupy Wall Street movement floundered. That went nowhere. And it's just a lot of people have they're not happy. There's no light at the end of the tunnel. Do you feel that, our country, we can be pulled back from the abyss? And
great question, Christian. Let's get Lee in there. Thank you. Go ahead, Lee.
It's never too late. We've been working daily, 24/7 on this. We take the Fed Reserve, give it to the Treasury Department, get rid of all the immoral debt, all this bailout money, claw it all back, grab it from the banks. That means we're probably only 5T of national debt. If you knew how many private people got that received funds that were unlawfully given, they weren't, and then we have to pay interest on it, we would be able to at least have only a national debt of 5T. If I got my 15T clear and you got the taxes from the upper 15, I'll make a difference. I'll get it down to zero. I don't mind doing that because I work for all of us. I don't work for some political game or a party. There's no difference between a Democrat and Republican. But we can save our country, which is a great nation, and serve under the Constitutional Republic and abort all these laws that were illegally created. People in Congress, the lobbyists control Congress, and the staff controls the senators and the House of Representatives. The staff is the brainchild, and whatever the lobbyists decide, that's what they get. Under Reagan, lobbyists could not give you any money. You were required to do like a white paper or a booklet that everybody would read it, including the public. There was no hanky-panky going on. They don't like to hear that, but all these people are rich working for us.
All right, Christian in L.A.
And we are the employer.
Christian in L.A., thank you for the call. Stan is in Denver on the wild card line. Hello, Stan. Welcome to Coast. Good morning.
Hello, thank you. And I think George Norrie did fine putting you on the air.
I appreciate that. Thank you.
Hello, Ambassador Wanta.
Good morning.
And he was your Canadian ambassador, right? I have a few questions, and I'm glad the Lon came on first because that's a great segue for my questions. Well, I watch a lot of documentaries, and a lot of them turn out that it started out with Neil Bush, and I'm just wondering, it's my opinion, that why aren't the Bushes in jail by now? They all are so crooked, and the evidence is right staring us in the face.
All right. Well, again, I have to caution you about throwing terms like that around. We can have allegations, but we have to be responsible on the airwaves as well. However, let me get Lee and Marilyn to respond to that.
Well, I think one important thing, Stan, is that Lee was in Denver investigating Neil Bush, so he's very aware of a lot of what you're talking about. and Lee, I'm sure you can.
Yeah, we have never given up hope, never. We have charged these people. We had Treasury investigations, internal affairs on George Bush Sr., And we have always fought these guys. The trouble is, the people that help us investigate, they get kicked out of their employment too, because they control the purse strings. If you're not part of them, you're out of here, mister.
What is odious debt, Marilyn? What does odious debt mean?
Oh, that's a good question. In fact, I would encourage everybody who's listening to look up odious debt and immoral debt. And I wrote an article about that for, I don't remember who I wrote it for. But basically, it's unconstitutional debt would be the best way to translate it. And your third caller made a good point. The Federal Reserve System is an unlawful agency that is a private corporation. I'm sure your listeners know that is not in any way federal. That Article 1, Section 8 of the Constitution of the United States gives the responsibility for the money, the debt, the coinage, everything to the United States Congress. They may have passed the Federal Reserve Act. They do not have the authority to change the Constitution without a vote of the people and an amendment being added to the Constitution. Therefore, anything that has been created in the way of debt, Richard, by the Federal Reserve System can be considered unlawful. It is immoral, in other words, because it is unconstitutional. They did not have the right to generate that debt.
All right. West of the Rockies, Doug is in Des Moines, Washington. Doug, welcome. Good morning. Are you there, Doug? Doug in Des Moines, going once, going twice. All right, let's move over to the first-time caller line. John is in Tampa Bay, Florida this morning. Welcome to Coast, John.
Thank you, Richard. I'd like to ask the ambassador a question. If he does get the money back and it's available to him, why can't he back a third party with righteous people like Jesse Ventura and Russ Feingold, so that America could actually vote for somebody who isn't attached to the international bankers and the military-industrial complex to bring America back to the righteous state that it was before John Kennedy was assassinated? And then I have a second question, if I can get it in.
All right, Lee.
Well, I'm not a politician, and the Democrats and Republicans are the same party. So a third party would get beat out by these guys because, remember, they used to say who counts the votes wins the election.
All right, John, you had a second question?
The rules that a third party will never get in.
Okay, John, a quick second question.
The last question was whether or not he might be considering giving any money to Switzerland's righteous king, whose power was usurped in the 15th century, and that way we would get rid of the international bankers that are controlling the military-industrial complex. That's Switzerland's king.
I didn't know anything about a Swiss king, but the military-industrial complex, President Reagan wanted to get rid of them a long time ago.
All right. Thank you for the call, John in Tampa Bay. Lee, obviously, I can't delve too deeply into this because, your security is important. But what is your status? I mean, do you have a permanent residence in the United States, or are you sort of a nomad?
No, I'm a permanent resident of Austria. They kidnapped me. I've been renditioned, and to leave this country would be wrong. They've dragged me back in chains and shackles for crimes that never occurred. They offered me a pardon, a full pardon, to give me $250,000. How can you be pardoned for a crime that never happened in a court that had no jurisdiction?
Are you safe? I mean, do you still feel this sort of Damocles over you? Are you safe?
I worry all the time. I pray all the time. But I remember the sisters of Notre Dame when I went to parochial school. They assured me, and the rest of my classmates, I'll never die before my time as well as them. And I take them at their word.
Is part of the reason that you haven't met face-to-face with your official biographer, Marilyn, is because you fear that people that sort of come in contact with you, their lives would be in peril?
Absolutely. She is very important to our country. And for me to be near her or anybody right now, they're going to say, aha, that's part of his team. They're the bad guys because they want to save the country. Well, we got to be careful.
Marilyn, I just have a couple minutes here. I don't want to leave anything on the table. What haven't I asked you, that you think is important to say?
Oh, I think you've asked wonderful questions. I think your callers have asked wonderful questions, with one exception. But basically, this is a hard story to tell. It's a hard story to understand. I hope people will read it, because the secret to the whole thing, to solving all these problems, to go back to your Los Angeles caller, Richard, is, people have a responsibility. A lot of what's going wrong now is not just the fault of government. It's the fault of the apathy of the people. We let it happen. My generation, Lee's 74, I'm 77, and we let it happen, and that's why I'm fighting as hard as I can. State banks is part of the answer. There are solutions. We need to be looking into implementing state banks in every state in the United States. Cut off the head of the Federal Reserve by keeping state tax dollars in the state.
All right, listen, I got to run, but what a great pleasure to speak and meet you, Lee Wanta, and Marilyn.
My pleasure. Thank you so much.
Thank you for spending the evening with us.
My pleasure.
My thanks to Lisa Lyon, George Norrie, Chris Boros, Stephanie Smith, Brian Opry, Gina Salvati, Tim Binal, and here in our AM 640 studios, Gord Harris, Scott Guest, and Laura Taylor. And thank you all for listening at home. Thank you. Thank you for your ears. Good night.